Hello and welcome back to our tutorial series. On the last episode, we edited this picture, and I made a comment on Facebook that if we'd started with a JPEG instead of a RAW image, we wouldn't have ended up with such a pleasing result. And that's because JPEGs are a compressed image format. They're made by a camera at the time of exposure. Your camera looks at the scene and the lighting, and it does its best guess about how it should look. Whereas a RAW image format just takes all of that raw data, stores it in a much bigger file, uncompressed, and then when you're at home, you have the opportunity to go back and change it however you want. Now, this is what we ended up with at the end of last week's episode. I'm gonna hit the backslash key and show you how it started. Now, what I've done is I've taken this raw image and I've converted it to a JPEG. I'm gonna hit the right arrow on my keyboard. I'm gonna show you this is the JPEG. They are identical. Now, I've kind of written down a recipe on how to make this look as close to the last image as possible. So I'm just going to go ahead and do that right now. In fact, I need to jump back over to the previous picture. I'm going to hit Control-Shift-C on my keyboard, and I'm going to copy the settings from before. I'm going to flip back over, Control-Shift-V, and because the formats do have different color spaces and whatnot, things automatically don't look quite correct. So I need to do some quick adjustments here to try to get it kind of in the ballpark of last week's. It's really quite tricky again because there's not a one-to-one formula for making JPEGs look like raw images or vice versa. All right, I'm going to say that that's pretty close for now. I'm actually going to jump out of develop mode, come back here, and I'm going to show you these two pictures side by side so you can appreciate the differences. Now, with the extra information you get in a raw format picture, the computer knows that the yellowness of her skin that we started with is not the same as the orangeness of her hair. And that's why we were able to separate these quite easily when we adjusted temperature before. On the JPEG, because there's not as much information to pull from, when we adjusted down to make her skin look correct, it made her hair basically turn into a brunette. We have other small differences like her makeup that was formerly blue and correct now looks purple. So you end up with these kinds of weird things. In fact, I'm going to point out one other little effect that is a problem with JPEGs. Because they don't have quite the dynamic range or color gamut, you end up with these weird artifacts here where there's just not enough data for the computer to pull from. It knows what the JPEG thinks these values are, but because it doesn't have the large spectrum of values to choose from, you don't get a smooth look over here. You get this kind of blotchy look. All right, so that's why we like raw images. So let's jump into this week's image. So this was taken with a Nikon D60. It's an older DSLR. It's using a fairly cheap 50mm lens. And I chose this picture because it's got a great use of long exposure. This is a 9-second picture, and because of that, the waves have this nice creamy, dreamlike look. This is achieved by shooting with a really, really small aperture. So this was shot at f22, you can see up here. What that does, though, is it allows any little speck of dust on your sensor or your lens to show up really, really well. And you're looking at this right now and thinking like, oh, there's one there and one there and one here. But if you were to print this out, you would suddenly see dozens, if not hundreds of specks. There's something about the printing process that allows you to see small imperfections that you don't pick up on your computer screen. So what I'm going to do is jump in here to my tone curve. I'm going to pull out this crazy tool that I put together. It allows you to see how everything... Oh, actually, let me show you something real quick. In RGB mode, you can see this crazy kind of sine wave going on. That's what this tone curve looks like. And what it allows you to do is come in here and grab your spot removal brush and really quickly identify these spots that are most egregious. And I'm not going to go through these with a lot of fine-tooth comb perfection, but I want to show you a cool tip. If you push page down, you will jump down to the next part of the frame. If I hit, let's grab this one real quick. Hit page down again, it takes me to the bottom. Now if I hit page down again, it drops me back, or pulls me up to the top of the image one column over. So this is a really convenient way if you're just trying to blaze through and find these kind of imperfections to navigate the window. That way you're not having to drag around your cursor or maybe get lost and you're trying to This one did not line up very well. That works. All right, so like I said, I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but I want to show you this neat little tool for finding spots. And then simply to go back, you just choose the previous tone curve, and magically all of your spots are gone. So if you chose to print this, you wouldn't see anything. So I like this picture. Like I said, it's got a great dreamlike quality, but I think it needs a little bit more contrast. I want this to look almost like something you would see in a dream. I want the colors to be very vibrant by the end. In fact, do you remember when we were in tone curve, we saw that crazy kind of S-shaped thing? You can do that here in your basics panel, where if you grab the highlights and the whites, which represent kind of the top of the curve, and then the shadows and the blacks, which represent the bottom of the curve, and kind of pull them in opposite directions, you end up with this nice kind of creamy look because you've pulled out extra data from the shadows and brought down the highlights. So you've kind of flattened the image in a tonal capacity. We're gonna raise up clarity. This is something you could probably go really crazy and make it look like an HDR, but we don't want to do that. Vibrance is looking pretty good right about there. However, you're thinking, this doesn't look that different from what we started. And that's because we're gonna go back to tone curves. And I'm gonna show you another powerful tool. So these can actually be used for adjusting contrast. So typically what you'll do is make a very subtle S-curve where you pull down the low. Oh yeah, I should point out what's going on. This right side of the image matches up with the histogram. This is the brighter side, and this is the shadows and the blacks and the darker end. So it matches up with this side. As you make these adjustments though, you affect the way that contrast is portrayed in those individual zones, whereas if you're just using the basic panel, contrast is just a slider. So tone curve gives you a lot more control over those kinds of contrast adjustments. However, RGB stands for red, green, blue, and individually you can modify the channels themselves. This is a really cool ability. So if I want to take down the reds in the shadow area, all I do is I simply pull this down. And you can see that the reddish tone we had in there is gone. Same thing with greens. We might want to come in here and pull those down. And what it's going to do, it's going to give us this nice kind of magenta purpley look. Now, I like to think of this shot as being an early morning sunrise in the Mediterranean, perhaps. And as such, the morning often has kind of a bluish, kind of cooler look to it. Something like that. I think that's looking pretty good already. Now, one of the drawbacks of taking a 9-second picture is that if it's a windy day or anything, your camera's going to get pushed around enough that you're going to lose really fine detail. And that's what we see in this picture. There's not a lot of sharpness in the wood here. So we're going to come down to the details panel. You guys know that I love 50-50 on these as a starting point, but that still doesn't really get us where we need to be. I'm going to go in here with radius and change it from a 1 to a 2. And I'm going to go from detail 25 to 50 and see if that can pull out some information. It's looking kind of better, but I really want that wood to have a lot of presence. I'm thinking that's finally looking pretty good and sharp. So we pull out of that. I think this picture pretty much just needs maybe a small vignette. I like them, other people don't. It's totally a preference thing. So I'm going to call that picture good right there. Let's look at the before and the after. So hopefully you like what you saw. Hopefully I addressed the questions about JPEG versus RAW, and hopefully you'll tune in next Friday for another episode.